The Brutalist is the apparent frontrunner for Best Picture at the Oscars, and in this video, we're going to review it. Welcome back to Movies Good, Internet Bad. I'm Corey. That's Shane. Please subscribe. Let's dive right in. Shane, what are your overall impressions on this behemoth of a movie?
Yeah, I'm interested to see how our impressions differ because you saw this movie only once, right? But 4-ish months ago, right?
Uh, a couple months ago, yeah.
Okay,
It's fuzzy for me at this point.
got
I
it.
had to kind of go back and reread a little bit about it to remember what happens.
Got it.
So,
Well, I'm fresh off it. I saw it yesterday.
yeah.
Um, Overall, I would say I think it's an excellent movie. I think if you are interested at all in the art of filmmaking or cinema or any of that, you should go see it. I think it's a tough ask for normal people, like a wide audience. This is very much kind of a niche type of film. So I expect the wide audiences probably won't flock to go see it, or if they do, they'll see it at home several months from now. The cinematography is spectacular. We'll talk about it in a little bit specifically, but beautiful movie. Shooting in VistaVision was absolutely the right choice. The acting is stellar. I think Adrien Brody is excellent. Guy Pearce is excellent. Guy Pearce reminds me of I couldn't get it out of my head. He reminds me of Lieutenant Aldo Rain. He
It's the
looks
mustache.
yes,
It's
he
the
looks
mustache. Yeah.
exactly like Brad Pitt in Inglorious Bastards, and I couldn't get it out of my head. Uh, but I think Felicity Jones is good, not great. I think she's good. It's just for some reason, whenever I see her in a movie, I can't shake the fact that it's Felicity Jones. Like
Mm,
she's just so
okay.
distinct that I couldn't quite connect to the character because, and not only that, but I think she reminds me a lot of her character in The Theory of Everything. She's playing a similar type of role, and
Sure.
obviously she won the Oscar for that, right? Theory of
I think
Everything.
so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
I mean, she
like
was at least nominated. Yeah.
yeah, and she does well. I just it seemed a little bit too similar there for me. I think where this movie, and I'm grasping at straws here a little bit, but I think where it lets itself down a little bit is the script and the story, specifically in the second half of the film. I was
Okay.
totally engaged in the first half, and the second half makes a couple of choices, which we'll go over in the spoiler section. I think if you've seen the movie, you kind of know what I'm talking about. But if you've not seen the movie, then obviously I don't want to spoil it for you because it's a pretty major moment in the second act.
Yeah.
But I think a couple of those choices kind of betray the narrative and the subtlety of the storytelling that's going on in the first half. And that's
Okay.
where it kind of lost some points for me. But overall, I think spectacular achievement. It's a little bit pompous and arrogant, but it does it so well that I don't care. Like
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
am
Yeah.
totally fine with like you doing this. Like there's an intermission and like all the titles are like old timey. You put the VistaVision logo at the beginning.
Hmm.
Like all of this stuff
Yep.
is so like uppity filmmaking. But if you do it so well, I don't care. Right.
Doesn't matter. Right. Yeah.
Right. And so I think, this is a movie made for filmmaking fans. And I think if you
Okay.
are a fan of the art, you will enjoy this a lot.
Hmm. Interesting. Uh, I remember because I saw this during the film festival that I went to, and it was, I think it showed, it was either about halfway or 2/3 of the way through the week. I was exhausted by the
Yeah.
end of the movie, but that was just because of the nature of how I saw it. Right.
Hmm.
That being said, having the intermission in there was an absolute godsend.
Agreed.
And like being able to go to the bathroom,
Yes.
refill on a Diet Coke, and get some caffeine into my system, it was actually really needed. And with a movie that's this long, uh, the thing that I thought about was how a year prior we went and saw Killers of the Flower Moon,
Yes.
which is also 3.5 hours long, but that movie doesn't have an intermission in it.
Agreed. Yeah.
And by the time that was done, my eyes were like bleeding,
Yes.
right? Having the intermission to just like decompress for a few minutes and just like come back in with a fresh set of eyes and a fresh bladder and all that other kind of stuff uh, was one of the best decisions of the movie to me, which is a weird thing to
Yeah.
say because it's purely a functional thing,
Correct.
uh, but it made it possible for me to stay engaged for the full 3 hours and 15 minutes or whatever it is. Um, I'll echo a lot of your sentiments. The acting is off the charts. Adrian Brody's a absolute monster in this movie.
Hmm.
He's so good. The cinematography blew me away, especially considering the film only had somewhere around a $10 million budget,
Yeah, I was gonna
right?
say that. Like,
Crazy.
comparing that movie to something like Oppenheimer from a year ago, which had 10 times the budget, I
Yeah.
didn't feel like they were any different in terms of production value. Obviously, you have the IMAX aspect of Oppenheimer and the
Well, sure, but
cast.
both on film,
But
right?
yeah,
Like
yeah,
none are digital,
yep.
so there's the expense of having the film and everything. And uh, I'm sure that Adrien Brody and Guy Pearce and Felicity Jones don't come cheap these days, but
Probably
um,
cheaper than Matt Damon and Cillian Murphy
well,
and
sure,
everyone, right?
yeah.
So,
If you're comparing it to Oppenheimer,
yes.
yeah, but I mean, somehow they made that movie for only $10 million,
Yeah.
and it's just one of those things where, like you're saying, if you're teaching a class in a film school and you want to teach your class about efficiency
Mhm.
and how to make the most out of every dollar that you're given and make sure it lands on the screen, holy cow, like
Yeah.
this is a really amazing way to do that. So
Yeah, I agree.
um, I'm curious to see how it does awards wise. Obviously, it did pretty well at the Golden Globes. Oscars, sometimes they're a different animal, so we'll see. Um, but I do feel like this one's kind of nestled in first place right now as
Yeah.
the front runner to
It
kind of take
is
everything home.
currently the betting favorite. It's, for negative 170 odds or something like that. Uh,
Do you bet on the Oscars, Shane?
no, God. You just never know, but it is definitely the favorite. And I think for good reason. It's got a lot going for it.
Yeah.
We'll get into my faults later, but like in terms of just a cinematic achievement, I think this is excellent. Like it's like you said, it does not feel like a $10 million indie movie. It feels like something
No.
much bigger, especially when
Hmm.
you compare the other VistaVision film that is coming out this year, which is Paul Thomas Anderson's movie with Leonardo DiCaprio,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
and that's like $115 million budget. So it's interesting
Yeah. But
just even
30
comparing
million of
that.
that goes to Leo.
Yeah, yeah, that's true.
Well,
um,
actually, sorry, it's only 25 million because if it's over 25, Leo doesn't want it.
that's a
Is that
good
a good
one.
joke?
That is a good
Okay?
one.
All right, very
I
fair
like
enough.
it. I like it.
Um, but yeah, we'll see what happens awards wise. This one kind of feels like, I don't want to say Oscar bait because I don't think that's the right word because it's a really good movie too,
Yeah.
but it plays into the hands of Oscar voters. I
Yes.
would say period piece, shot on film,
Yep.
terrific performances. It feels like an old movie that was made in today's day and age of cinema, and I feel like that's going to score a lot of points for it
Yeah,
moving
it
forward.
feels like Brady Corbet is trying to do his best "There Will Be Blood" impression, or something
Yeah,
like
yeah, yeah.
David Lean. He in the directors on directors with Sean Baker. He mentions David Lean. I was like, yeah, that's a pretty heavy inspiration for what this is
Hmm.
doing. Something like Lawrence
Yep.
of Arabia is very similar, where it's almost 4 hours long with an intermission. And so, definitely trying to capture that epicness and trying to create kind of a modern epic.
Yeah. Were you locked in the minute you saw that upside down Statue of Liberty shot?
That first shot, well, I guess it's not the first shot, but immediately where it's that long take and it's very chaotic on the ferry and they go up and then see the Statue of Liberty, I was like, okay, this, you just
We're
know
in.
that
Yeah.
this is something special right away.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I agree. And the cinematography, let's talk about that first. I mean, obviously, he shot it on VistaVision, which, for
Yeah.
those who are unaware of it, it's taking film and turning it sideways so you can get a
Yeah.
wider aspect ratio. Whereas in the past, that on 35 millimeter, that was done using anamorphic lenses. But when you do that, you reduce the resolution because you're essentially
Hmm.
squeezing the image
Squeezing the image. Yeah.
into 35 millimeter. Whereas this lets it be the full resolution.
Yeah.
Um, and apparently, one of the main reasons he shot on that format is because the time period in which the movie is set, for most of it, not all of it, is when VistaVision was kind of coming to
Mhm.
prominence. 1952, I believe, is when it was
Yeah,
invented.
yeah. I think North by Northwest, Vertigo, all those Hitchcock movies from that era, all shot on VistaVision, right?
Yes.
So it's of the time of the
Hmm.
movie.
Yeah. And I think it was a good choice. It's absolutely gorgeous. I think the cinematography is probably its best aspect. I also loved how in each little, I wouldn't say scene or act break, because there's really act one, act two, but
Right.
when you're kind of switching locations, he does these little montages of architecture or
Hmm.
something like that, where he's cutting it to music, and all of those shots are just gorgeous. And this
Yeah.
format really excels at shooting stuff like that.
Well, that's another inherent part of doing the VistaVision thing is that this movie's in a 166 to 1 aspect ratio, which if you're watching that on a modern television, there's going to be some pillar boxing, black
Correct.
bars on the left and right side of the
Correct.
screen instead of the top and bottom,
Yep.
like you would see if you're watching a CinemaScope movie.
Yep.
But that's because when you rotate the film sideways, it leans more towards that. And the cinematographer was even quoted saying part of the reason we did that is because we wanted to frame all of those architecture scenes really tall.
Got it.
It's kind of like when Steven Spielberg made Jurassic Park and he shot it in 185 because
Yep.
he wanted all the dinosaurs to feel huge,
Yep.
right? Same concept, just with the architecture here, which kind of led to the filmmaking decision, which is super cool in my
Yeah.
opinion.
Yeah. And for those unaware, IMAX uses a very similar type of process. It's not exactly the same, but IMAX does it on 70 millimeter. And so you get this massive
Just
vertical
huge film,
image.
yeah.
Really, VistaVision was one of the precursors to what IMAX would later become.
Yep.
So you can think of it similar, like when Oppenheimer comes out and it's shot in full IMAX, the same type of excitement was going on back then in the 50s when something was shot
Yep.
on VistaVision. It was the big spectacle, right?
Yeah. And if you go back and watch, like North by Northwest just got a 4K release,
Yep.
and they scanned it in at 13K because the resolution is that high off the VistaVision print.
Yeah.
It looks unbelievable. The amount of detail they captured back in the 50s is astonishing.
Yeah.
And it's just because of the format. It's just like I went and saw Oppenheimer in 70 millimeter IMAX. I drove 3 hours away from home to go see it that way. Watching it at home was great a year later, but nothing will ever top that experience because just the amount of detail in that film. And it was very similar. I got to see Brutalist in 35 at the film festival. It's one of the only movies they actually showed in 35
Oh,
while we
nice.
were there. And, you get, it's one of those movies that, because it's supposed to look and feel like an old film, that when you get the little specks of dust and the dirt and all the imperfections on the film, it just adds to that experience even
Yeah.
more.
I mean, you
And I
can
know that they're,
see the gate weave on some of the like
yeah,
wider
oh yeah.
shots where it's
Hmm.
just subtly shaking a little bit.
Yep, there's a little bit of jitter there,
Yep.
but if you're lucky enough to be in one of the areas that's showing this in 35, it's worth seeking out.
Yeah.
I think anytime a movie's showing on film, it's just a cool experience. It's very different. We did when we saw it. They started the movie and there was no audio,
Oh no.
and like 5 minutes in, everybody was like kind of looking around, like, "Is this
Oh
supposed to be
no.
silent?"
They
We didn't know,
restart it?
and then they had to
Oh,
pull the film back and
that
they
sucks.
restarted it with audio and everything. But yeah, that's film.
Yeah.
It's a lost art.
Yeah.
Film projection. So it is one of the risks that you take when you go to see a movie like that. But it was pretty awesome. So
Nice.
so let's dive into some story stuff and maybe some of your criticisms that you have of the film.
Yeah. So I think where I was alluding to is, the big one, right? The rape scene to me
Yeah.
was when that moment happened. I think, I mean, I was seeing it in a full theater, but you could almost feel the deflation of the audience when that scene happens
Mm-hmm.
because it's just like, oh, we're doing this. And that was my big critique of the movie is the first half you tell this like subtle metaphor. It's not super subtle, but like under the surface metaphor of he
Mm-hmm.
leaves Europe, the Holocaust, and he's, exploited in Europe, right? And he comes
Yep.
to America and the same thing happens. Obviously not the same thing. I do not want to equate the experience. But it is trying to make this statement on you think you're free, but you're really not. And I think there's a
Right.
line in the beginning of the movie that's like a quote that is obviously the thesis of that first half, where you come over to America, it's the American dream, and it turns out that you're just kind of in the same spot. You're working for this super rich guy. You end up having to give away all the money that you're making from this project, and so you're kind of doing unpaid labor, right?
Mm-hmm.
And he's kind of trapped in this situation. His wife is far away, just as she was in Europe, right? She's in New York
Mm-hmm.
instead of, and so like his situation, while obviously it is not the same as concentration camps, is similar on a thematic level. And then when you get to
Okay.
act two and that rape scene happens, it no longer becomes a metaphor. It becomes like Brady Corbet saying, "This is what I'm saying. They are raping the immigrants." And it's like once it did that, it kind of betrayed all of that first act stuff that I really loved. Like coming out
Okay.
of the into the intermission, I was like, man, this is a masterpiece. Like 5 stars. I have no faults with this film. And then it
Yeah.
just didn't stick the landing for me.
Okay. So you didn't think the epilogue at the end, where it kind of pulls the magic trick, where you find out the real meaning behind the community center,
I thought
like,
that
because for me that made the movie, like, that took it up a tick for me.
yes, but I also feel like it's almost stating it too outright, where it's kind of revealing at the end, like, by the way, he was building his own prison. But like you kind of get that vibe anyways, and they maybe could have revealed it in a less matter of fact way. I
Okay,
did like
that's
the
fair.
epilogue for one specific reason, and that is when he cuts to the 80s music and then he's
Mhm.
doing all these shots of Venice cut to the
Yeah, yeah,
80s
yeah.
music. I just went to Venice this past year and I was like,
Oh,
man,
okay.
I've stood right there. And like it was a
Yeah, that's
really
cool.
like cool nostalgia trick for me. Um, but yeah, otherwise, I'm interested to hear your thoughts on the character of Jofia because she bookends the film, but to me, I didn't really understand the intent of that. I don't think she does enough to the narrative
That's
to
the daughter,
justify that.
right?
That's the niece.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I don't know. I think it kind of felt like we need someone to be the mouthpiece of the end of the story, but not one of the characters,
Okay.
because I think he wanted it to kind of be from an not an objective point of view, like just like a fly on the wall person. Like, hey, this is my uncle. He's great. This is look at all this shit he did. That's awesome. But while doing that, also spinning the tale of this is his finest masterwork, was this community center that ended up being a tribute to all these things, and the way that they explain it, and that he kind of did it underneath Harrison's nose the whole
Yeah.
time.
Yeah.
And the fact that you realize he didn't get so upset over all the design changes and the money stuff and everything because of money or career aspirations or anything like that. He got really worked up about it because of the personal side of things.
Correct. Yeah.
And having a different person who wasn't really in all of those scenes in the beginning of the movie to explain that, I guess that's kind of where it came from. I just thought it was really cool that it's one of those things. It's almost kind of like a Nora, where
Yes.
when you go back and watch it another time, with you when you have the knowledge of how it
Correct.
ends,
Yeah.
you start connecting all the dots and you go, oh, look at
Yeah.
that. Okay,
Yeah.
cool. Because uh, you know, personal anecdote. My partner, she's an interior designer, so when we were watching this, every time there was a budget consideration or a change in personnel or something that went in a different direction because of what a client required or whatever, I kind of like turned and looked at her, and I could like see her having PTSD
And
because of what was happening on screen. And then at the end, when you find out the real reason why, and it's not just the work stuff, but it's all the personal, it hit like a ton of bricks for me.
yeah, and there's an obvious second kind of statement going on here, which is the conflict between studio executives and
And
filmmakers,
art,
right?
yeah,
There's that scene in the film which is by far got the most laughs of anything, and it's not a very funny movie, but there's one scene that's very funny where he calls over the other architect and he's like, "Everything ugly and stupid, but most of all ugly in this world
that's you.
is your fault." And it was as if Brady Corbet is saying that to studio executives
Yep.
directly through the screen. Also, the credits are set to music that's like one for you, one for me. And it almost felt too
Yeah.
on the nose at that aspect. Um,
Well, if you go on and watch the that directors on directors thing with him and Sean
he does
Baker,
say one for you, one for me once in
and
that.
he does, and he also talks about how, like, he's like, why does something that requires a, $100 million budget have to involve capes fighting aliens
Yeah.
or something? He says something
He
very tongue in
says
cheek
no.
about that.
He says, why is it okay if there's a 3 hour movie with people wearing capes, but not a
That's
three
what it
hour
is. That's what
adult
it is. Yeah.
drama? Which I
And
tend to agree
he's
with.
trying to paint the picture. He's like, how are we supposed to cover 40 years of someone's life in an hour and a half?
Hmm.
We can't do it that way. It's got to be that 3 hour epic, or else you don't feel the time pass the same way that you would if it was condensed even down to 2 hours.
Yeah,
You know,
he even mentioned in that directors on directors that as he tried to cut down the movie to make it shorter, he said that sometimes when he took stuff out, it kind of was to the movie's detriment because it's supposed to drag a little bit. in some
Yeah.
parts. You're supposed
Hmm.
to feel the weight and the time a
Yep.
little bit and sit with the story as it's unfolding. And otherwise, you end up just hitting the beats, and then you kind of lose the impact of each beat. This is like the anti Rise of Skywalker, right? Where Rise of Skywalker is packing as
Go, go,
much
go,
as
go, 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 go,
possible, and
go, go.
this is like, let's let it die, let it breathe a little bit, which I
They fly
appreciate.
now.
Yeah, I didn't feel like it was too long. My wife did. She thought it was way too long, but
Even with the
uh
intermission, she still
yeah,
thought it was.
yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
But I personally didn't feel like it was too long. You know what you sign up for, right? You're walking into a
Sure.
3.5 hour historical drama.
Yeah,
It
I'm
is what
curious.
it
Did she
is.
feel the same way about Oppenheimer
Yes.
or
Yeah.
Killers of the Flower
Yeah.
Moon?
And she felt the same way
So
about both.
maybe there's
So
just like a
yeah.
threshold
Yeah.
for, but that's a good talking point, right? Because we're talking about like the general audience,
Yeah.
right? Is the general audience going to even consider getting out of bed and going to the cinema? Where say it takes 30 minutes to drive to the cinema, then you've got 3.5 hours. That's 4 hours. Then you've got another half hour back. That's like almost your whole day,
Yeah.
right? Like your whole day yesterday was going to
Was
see the
yes.
Brutalist,
Yeah.
right?
And I think that was kind of the miracle of Oppenheimer, is that general audiences did connect with it. And
Yeah,
I think part of it is, while it is a 3 hour epic, that movie, it does a lot of cinematic tricks to make it seem like an action movie, with like
sure.
the Hans
Even
Zimmer
though it isn't. Yeah,
score, and
yeah,
it's
yeah, yeah, yeah.
edited like an action film, like a big huge film, but it's really a
There's that one
personal
scene where
story.
Oppenheimer suits up and he's got the
Yeah.
hat and the
Yeah.
tie and everything on the table. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah,
and
yeah.
so I think that's a good compromise, right? Where you can tell this personal story, but you can also appeal to general audiences. And I think that's probably the best aspect of Oppenheimer, is how much of a miracle it was that it made as much money as it did.
Yeah, for sure. Um, I want to talk for 2 seconds about Guy Pearce
Yeah,
because I think this is probably the best performance of his career,
I would agree.
if not close to it. Um, he he pulls off a fascinating magic trick of being deliriously charming in the first act of the movie,
Yeah.
and then when the turn happens and he's you kind of have a feeling because it's like, oh, it's the rich old white guy, of course he's the bad guy, right?
Yeah.
But like he's just everybody's friend in the first half of that
Mhm.
movie, right? And he's the savior of the community, and he's a leader, and all this other stuff. And then when it starts to turn, it makes that like hurt way more than it
Yeah.
should have.
I mean, I think his performance is awesome. I think he was excellent. I think all of his, like, you've met a person like him before, right? Where
Of
got
course.
super
Yep.
rich off some business venture, but like wants to be culturally relevant type of person. And like when he kept saying, "I find our conversations intellectually stimulating," it was like,
Hmm.
you know that person, right?
Yep.
And I thought his performance was excellent. However, I thought, if you, going back to the rape scene, if it would almost be more tragic to me if he thought he was the good guy the whole time,
Right.
right? And,
Sure.
and it's almost like the Jurassic Park thing, where you're just talking about that with the 185 aspect ratio. It's like Richard Attenborough in Jurassic Park. He's kind of the bad guy, but he doesn't think he is.
No,
And
he's
I
fully committed, and he's
and
like,
I
this is the
like
best thing ever.
to me, that is where this movie could have gone up a level, is if
That's
you
fair.
made him this guy who thinks he's doing good, but at the same time he's just enforcing the status quo. it's
Hmm.
it's kind of like, and this is a little different, but the Zone of Interest last year, where that guy, the main guy in the Zone of Interest, is just like doing his job, right? And
Right.
he's like, I'm, working hard. I'm a family man. Blah blah blah. He thinks he's doing fine.
Hmm.
Obviously, a little bit more intense than what happens in
Sure.
The Brutalist, but it's a similar type of thing, and a similar type of concept. And to me, I felt like that would have been a much more powerful message. Is like, this guy thinks he is benevolent and supporting the arts, and at the same time, he's just like slave laboring this guy and
Yeah.
trying to take credit for all the things that he has in his head.
Yeah. There's the one scene where he flicks the coin at
And he's
Adrien
like, "I'll
Brody's
give it
character,
back."
And then he makes him give it back, and
Yeah.
I was like, "Oh no, he really is evil. Oh
Yeah.
god." Like,
See, stuff like
because
that
that
though
he
is
doesn't need that money,
right,
right?
right.
Like, but he still asked for it back. It's like, come on,
Yeah,
man.
and I one thing I did find interesting though is the ending of the movie. Let's talk about that because that's a
Sure.
big moment. At least my impression is that he killed himself. I don't know if that's the actual ending, but I don't think it matters. I think it's meant to be a little bit
I
ambiguous.
I think that's what's inferred,
Yeah,
is that he just he broke,
yeah.
and that's what happened.
I
So
thought they were going to find him in the water because he mentioned that he couldn't swim like way earlier in the film.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
So I thought that was a little setup, but didn't happen there. Especially they're in the water in the shots. I was like, they're
Hmm.
going to find him in the water, and they didn't. So I thought that was interesting. Um, but another thing that I kind of picked up on is this like, and I'm not sure if the movie was trying to do this, but sort of this like cycle of abuse thing where I think
Okay.
the impression or the implication is that the son was molested by the dad, and that's why he gets all worked up about the accusation and goes nuts, right? Because he knows the whole time he's
Yeah.
experienced it, and then they kind of infer it earlier with him and Jofia that he might have sexually assaulted her earlier in the
Hmm.
movie. That one's left ambiguous as well, but there is
Yeah.
kind of a maybe an implication of cycle of abuse where the father abuses the son abuses somebody else, and
Hmm.
that. So I did you catch that too, or is that something
Oh
I'm making up?
no, no, it's there, and it a lot of it, like you said, it's left purposely ambiguous,
Yes.
where it's kind of just like a an air of griminess about it, that it's
Yeah.
like, hey, it's here, but guess what? This is America. We're gonna gloss right over it and move on to the next thing.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. I thought Joe Alwyn was hit or miss in that role. Early on, I was like, he's kind of monotonous in these deliveries, but then like when he
yeah,
gets some more emotion in there, I think he's much better.
he had a couple moments in the film that were good, but to me, there's three legs to the tripod here, and it's Adrien Brody, Felicity Jones, and Guy Pearce,
Yes.
and everybody else is there, but
Yeah.
just kind of there because they have to be.
Yeah. Utility players.
Exactly,
Yeah.
100%. Except for the guy that played shit, what was his name? Gordon, his fellow heroin addict.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
I thought he was very good,
Yeah.
and that I didn't know if the drug stuff needed to be part of the
Yeah,
movie,
right? Because it didn't
but
pay off
then
anywhere, but I guess it
in
had
well in
the
the second
the
half,
overdose
he
thing
when they're in where do they go? Is it Italy for the oh god, where do they go?
for the very end, the epilogue?
No, no, no. When they go to the caves.
Oh, that's Italy. Yeah, it's in
Yeah,
Tuscany. Yeah.
Tuscany. That's it. Um, and he kind of has a little bit of a bender there,
Yeah.
and it's what leads to
Correct.
all the bad stuff.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, I guess that's why all the drug stuff was part of it, and
Yeah,
that's
and I
where they
think
were going with it.
there's a lot of stuff here that's also trying to give you a time and a place. The opioid crisis was very big around that
Yeah,
time
yeah,
period,
yeah.
so I think it's trying to play that aspect in. Also, the when he goes to the like pornography place to watch the
Hmm.
pornographic movies, like the 50s were very like conservative type of time, so that was kind
Yeah,
of
that was all
under like
taboo.
hush
Yeah.
hush. Yeah, so I think
Hmm.
he's trying to play into that, like people don't talk about sex, people don't talk about any of this stuff.
Right.
So I think part of that is just placemaking, not necessarily story making, which
Sure.
I'm okay with that. It might seem a little bit superfluous if you're just watching it for story reasons, but I think it helps you understand the time.
Well, the movement of time, right?
Well,
So
that
that
too.
you
Yeah.
really fully get the idea that this is a movie that starts, I think, in the mid to late 40s,
Yeah.
and it doesn't end until the 80s,
Yeah.
right? So you're looking at 30 plus years of time that passes. So you need some kind of marker
Yeah.
to
He also does
illustrate
a fun
what it
thing in
is.
the epilogue where he shoots on like digicam or whatever
Yeah,
for a
yeah,
lot of
yeah,
the
yeah.
shots, and I thought that was
Just
kind of cool. It's
the
like,
sign of the times
yeah,
kind of
the
thing, right?
filmmaking is evolving with the time in the story.
Yeah, they do that in oh god, I just watched it the other night. The Apprentice, the movie with Sebastian Stan and
Oh
Jeremy
yeah.
Strong.
Yeah.
There's a chunk of it that takes place in the 70s, and then a chunk that takes place in the 80s, and they use a very different post production pipeline on
Uh,
those to make them look like the film and news footage of the era.
Got it.
And it makes it's a very easy visual cue.
Yeah.
It works.
Yeah.
So it's pretty cool. But um, all right. Well, I think we've covered most of this. Any
Yeah.
final thoughts on the
No,
Brutalist?
I think I would not be upset if it won Best Picture, despite my faults with it. It's definitely an achievement. I don't think the achievement is as great as the movie wants it to be. I think it's taking
Okay.
itself very seriously and wants to be this spectacular all time
Sure.
classic. And I don't feel like it gets there, but it's still very good.
Okay. If you had to pick another movie that would beat it for Best Picture, what would it be?
Conclave? I mean, I don't know. I think it's got the best odds of the ones that I've seen.
Sure.
So I haven't seen
Yeah.
Amelia Perez, but I've seen, I think, most of the other frontrunners for Best Picture, and I think it's probably the best of all of them.
Yeah. I mean, I think Dune Part 2 is going to get a nomination.
You think
I
so?
don't think it's a serious contender to win.
Yeah.
I think it's a better movie than The Brutalist. Personally, it,
Okay.
it resonated with me more.
Got it.
But I think in terms of the Oscar race, I think it's pretty locked up at
Yeah.
this point.
Yeah. It would be a surprise, but surprises happen. You never know.
That is true. We might get a green book, and something else might
Conclave.
swoop in there. And
What would be the Green Book equivalent here? Like people are calling Amelia Perez that, but like Green Book was it winning a bunch before that? It was
I
kind
don't
of
think
like
so.
I think it was kind of out of nowhere at the Oscars that it was just the compromise pick. So
Yeah.
I don't know what the equivalent would be to Green Book this year.
Gosh, maybe Conclave.
Yeah, maybe.
Maybe I don't know.
I don't know.
I think there's a very good field of movies this year,
Yeah,
and to be honest with you, I wouldn't necessarily be upset about too many of them winning, if that makes sense. Like
yeah,
if Anora ended up winning instead of the Brutalist, I'd be like, yeah, sure, absolutely,
yeah, yeah,
because it's that good. So
yeah. I enjoyed both. But yeah,
cool. Well, I guess that's going to wrap this one up. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. If you have seen The Brutalist, let us know what you think. If you haven't seen The Brutalist, let us know if you're willing to make the trek out to the cinema to go see a 3.5 hour movie with an intermission. Like this video if you liked it. Subscribe to the channel if you like movies and you like what we're doing. We're going to be back later this week. We have a busy week. Skeleton Crew's wrapping up. Season 2 of Silos wrapping up, and season 2 of Severance is getting started, which we're going to be doing weekly reviews on because that show is awesome and we're really excited to talk about it. So stay tuned for all of that and so much more. And until next time, we'll see you guys in the next video.